It was one of those mornings where everything seemed off. The air in the office felt heavier than usual, almost like it was holding its breath in anticipation of something. I had barely sat down at my desk when I heard him, my boss, storming down the hallway, his footsteps echoing with purpose. I knew the moment he entered the room, there would be hell to pay. The usual tension was building, but today felt different. It all started with a simple mistake, or at least I thought it was simple. A small error in a report that I didn't think would matter in the grand scheme of things. But to him, it was a betrayal. His voice sliced through the air like a jagged knife, sharp and unforgiving. "You're a worthless dumbass," he spat, each word dripping with disdain. His face was red with anger, his eyes narrowed into slits of contempt. I froze. The words stung, but I had heard them before. My heart raced as I tried to suppress the rising tide of frustration. But this time, it felt different. I wasn't the same person I used to be. I wasn't going to take it anymore. There was something about that moment, something that flicked, a switch inside me. As I looked at him, standing there in his tailored suit, throwing his weight around like he had all the power in the world, I knew something had to change. I wasn't just going to apologize. I wasn't going to beg for forgiveness. I was going to prove him wrong. And in that one thought, something ignited deep inside me. Little did I know, that single moment of humiliation would become the catalyst for a transformation that none of us could have predicted. A month later, my boss would regret every word he had said that day, and I would be standing tall, stronger, and more confident than I had ever been before. The days following that heated confrontation in the office were a blur. I spent the next few weeks running on autopilot, each morning dragging myself into work with the weight of my boss's words heavy on my chest. It wasn't just the sting of the insult that bothered me. It was the realization that I had been letting this toxic environment shape who I was, allowing his petty criticisms to dictate my worth. I had spent years trying to appease him, trying to prove that I was good enough. But now, that moment had shaken something loose inside me. The desire to be the best version of myself, to stand up for myself, had taken root. The tension in the office was palpable. My boss, Mr. Harris, was a man who thrived on control, and when things didn't go his way, he let everyone around him know. He was a textbook bully, the kind who disguised his insecurities with sharp words and an inflated sense of importance. And yet, for some strange reason, I had always tried to win his approval. Maybe I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I made enough sacrifices, he would see my value. But deep down, I had always known that was a losing battle. It wasn't just Mr. Harris who was a part of this toxic dynamic. The rest of the team was walking on eggshells around him, each person trying to avoid his wrath while maintaining their own professional lives. I could see it clearly now, how his constant berating and harsh words had created an office culture of fear and compliance. No one ever dared speak up, and everyone silently suffered under his reign. The few who did speak out were quickly dismissed, shunted aside, or even let go. But it wasn't just Mr. Harris I had to deal with. There were my colleagues, too. Despite the apparent camaraderie we all shared, it became clear to me that the office was a place where appearances were more important than real connections. The people I thought were my friends quickly fell into line with Mr. Harris's leadership style, reinforcing the toxic environment. Take Karen, for example. She had been one of my closest allies in the office, or at least I thought she was. Over lunch one day, I overheard her talking to another coworker, casually referring to me as a bit too ambitious for my own good. Her words cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't that I hadn't heard this sentiment before, but hearing it from someone I trusted stung in a way that I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just her disapproval that bothered me. It was the way she tried to fit into Mr. Harris's mold. Despite this, Karen wasn't the only one who seemed to shrink under Mr. Harris's thumb. I realized that nearly everyone in the office was in the same boat, forced to conform to the toxic environment or risk being cast out. The truth was, we had all grown accustomed to the constant fear of being judged, critiqued, or belittled. We had become a group of employees with low self-esteem, just trying to make it through the day without attracting attention. And yet, I could feel the change happening inside of me. I had been so consumed with trying to fit in, trying to stay under the radar, that I had lost sight of my own goals. But now, the insult Mr. Harris had thrown at me had become the spark I needed. I wasn't just going to stay in this office and shrink into the background. I wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Mr. Harris, define who I was. The next morning, I arrived at work with a renewed sense of purpose. I would no longer be a passive participant in this toxic environment. It was time to reclaim my power. I began speaking up more in meetings, offering ideas, and standing my ground. Every time Mr. Harris made a cutting remark or belittled my contributions, I fought back, calmly but firmly. I could feel the shift in the room as my colleagues began to notice. They were watching, waiting to see if I would back down. And slowly, they started to change their own behavior. Karen, in particular, started to take notice of the changes in me. One day, after a particularly tense meeting with Mr. Harris, she approached me with an unusual softness in her voice. "You're different," she said, almost as if she were testing the waters. "You're standing up for yourself. I've never seen you do that before." I smiled, though I wasn't sure if I should trust her words. I had never been good at reading people, but something in her tone made me wonder if she too was tired of living under Mr. Harris's thumb. "I'm tired of letting people tell me who I am," I said, my voice steady. "I've spent too long trying to please people who don't deserve my time." Her eyes flickered with something close to admiration, but there was a hesitation in her gaze. It was as though she was weighing whether or not to join me on this journey of self-empowerment. But I wasn't about to wait for anyone's permission. I was on my own path now. As the days passed, the office dynamic began to shift. Mr. Harris's power started to wane as I became more vocal, more assertive. I could see that some of my colleagues were beginning to follow my lead, speaking up when they disagreed with him, challenging his ideas rather than just nodding along. It wasn't easy. The fear was still there, lingering in the corners of the room, but something had changed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. I didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of something bigger than I could have imagined. The office, once a place of stress and fear, was slowly transforming into a place where real change was possible. And Mr. Harris? Well, he had no idea what he had just unleashed. The change didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without its challenges. My confidence began to build, but the path was far from smooth. Every step forward was met with resistance, and I quickly learned that standing up for myself in a place like this wasn't just about speaking out. It was about being ready for the fallout, for the inevitable pushback that would come from those who had grown comfortable in the toxic environment. At first, the little victories were small. I would challenge Mr. Harris in meetings, offering a counterpoint when he tried to shut down my ideas. I started taking the lead on projects that had once been pushed aside by the louder voices in the office. I noticed something strange. People were beginning to pay attention. It wasn't just my coworkers who were watching. It was Mr. Harris, too. The way he looked at me now was different. There was an edge in his gaze, a wariness I hadn't seen before. And then, the tension escalated. The real test came when I was tasked with presenting a major report to a high-profile client. It was a project that had been in the works for months, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The pressure from Mr. Harris was suffocating. He micromanaged every detail of the presentation, nitpicking even the smallest points, demanding revisions at the last minute. The more I tried to assert myself, the more he dug in his heels. I could feel the old dynamic, creeping back in. The one where he was the boss, and I was just the worthless dumbass he had labeled me as weeks earlier. I wasn't going to let that happen again. I had to prove to him, and to myself, that I wasn't the same person anymore. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated: the silent saboteurs in the office, the colleagues who had once been friendly, but now seemed to be growing more distant. People like Karen, who had once expressed admiration for my new confidence, now began to avoid eye contact. The others, those who had been quiet for so long, suddenly started whispering behind my back. It became clear that my efforts to challenge Mr. Harris were shaking things up in ways I hadn't expected. The office was polarized, and I found myself in the center of it. There were the people who supported me, albeit quietly, and those who sided with Mr. Harris, scared of losing their own place in the pecking order. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of the boss, and they were willing to toe the line to keep their jobs. But it wasn't just the office politics that were at play. The real issue was my relationship with Mr. Harris. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of our existence in this corporate world. He had the power to make or break careers, and he knew it. Now, seeing me push back against him, seeing me challenge his authority, he began to feel threatened. At first, he tried to reassert his dominance in subtle ways. In meetings, he would speak over me, interrupting my points before I could finish them. He would take credit for ideas that were clearly mine, pushing me aside in front of others. It was a tactic he had used before, and it was effective, at least it used to be. But this time, something was different. I wasn't intimidated. I wasn't going to shrink into the background anymore. I was ready to fight back. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting where Mr. Harris had cut me off yet again, I found myself in the break room, trying to steady my breathing. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, and I could feel the heat of anger rising in my chest. I knew I had to confront him, but I couldn't shake the fear of what it might cost me. If I stood up to him too directly, would I lose everything? Just then, Karen entered the break room, her eyes avoiding mine. For a moment, I thought she might leave, but instead, she walked over, her expression pensive. "We need to talk," she said softly. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew this was a pivotal moment. I followed her to a quiet corner, away from the others. She looked at me, her brow furrowed with concern. "I don't know what's going on with you," she began, her voice low. "You've changed. You're not the same person anymore." There was no anger in her words, just a quiet bewilderment. "You used to be, well, a lot more passive. You never stood up for yourself. Like this. It's like you're trying to pick a fight with Mr. Harris." I felt a pang of frustration at her words. "I'm not trying to pick a fight, Karen. I'm just trying to stand up for myself. He can't keep treating me like I'm nothing. I've had enough of it." She crossed her arms, her gaze softening as if she were considering something. "Look, I get it. But you have to understand, it's not just about you and him, it's the whole office. You're stirring up a lot of tension. People don't like it when the balance gets disrupted." The words hit harder than I expected. For a moment, I considered backing down. Maybe Karen was right. Maybe I was rocking the boat too much. But then I remembered the look on Mr. Harris's face when he had called me a worthless dumbass. I remembered the months of silence, of being pushed aside. I had allowed myself to be small for so long, and now, for the first time in my career, I was finally speaking up. "I can't keep pretending it's fine," I said, my voice steady. "I can't keep sitting back and letting people walk all over me. If I'm going to make it here, I have to be myself." Karen sighed, but there was a hint of admiration in her eyes. "I don't know what's going to happen, but I can't say I'm not impressed. Just be careful. He's dangerous, and if you keep challenging him, things might get ugly." I didn't know if it was her warning or my own resolve that solidified the decision. But in that moment, I knew I couldn't back down. The fear of losing my job, of being cast out, no longer mattered. I was fighting for something more important: my self-respect, my dignity, and the person I had always known I could be. The next day, I prepared for the presentation. I knew it would be my biggest challenge yet, but I also knew this was my moment to show Mr. Harris and the rest of the office that I was no longer the timid person they had once known. I was ready to take control of my career. What I didn't know was that the real battle was about to begin. The fight for my career wasn't just about me versus Mr. Harris. It was about everything: the office culture, the relationships that had been built on fear, and the silent rebellion that was simmering beneath the surface. I was no longer just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't have a voice. And this was only the beginning. The day of the presentation arrived, and the tension was unbearable. I had prepared for weeks, perfecting every detail, rehearsing my speech, and double-checking the data. I knew that Mr. Harris would be there, sitting at the head of the table, waiting for me to fail. This was his stage, and I was merely the player in his game. But this time, things were different. I wasn't going to let him control the narrative. This time, I was in charge. As I walked into the conference room, the familiar stares of my colleagues hit me like a wave. They were watching, waiting to see what would happen. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Mr. Harris sat at the head of the table, his usual confident smirk replaced with a tense frown. He had already marked the presentation with his sharp criticisms and unwarranted expectations. He was ready for me to slip up, to give him a reason to tear me down. In front of everyone, I took a deep breath and started. My voice was steady, but my heart raced. The first few minutes went smoothly. I was in control, delivering my points with precision. I could see Mr. Harris's expression change slightly. He was no longer dismissing me so easily. His eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping impatiently on the table. But he didn't interrupt. Not yet. The momentum I had built quickly began to shift when I reached the key point in the presentation, the part where I had challenged the data he had originally provided. It was risky. I knew that if I pointed out the flaws in his work, I would be walking a fine line between standing my ground and disrespecting him. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't let him take credit for something that wasn't right. "Actually, Mr. Harris," I said, holding up the revised datasheet, "this doesn't align with our latest projections. I've cross-checked with several departments, and it looks like the numbers need further adjustment." I felt a rush of anxiety, but it was drowned out by the calm that had settled over me. This was the moment. This was my stand. The room fell silent. Mr. Harris's face turned red, his jaw tightening as he glared at me. I could almost feel the weight of his anger in the air, a storm ready to break. For a moment, I thought I might see the same venomous outburst he had thrown at me weeks ago. But something was different now. He hesitated. "I don't think you understand the scope of this project. Your name," he said, his voice cold. "This is my vision. I know what's best for the company." The words were sharp, but they no longer had the same weight. They didn't shake me like they once would have. I stood my ground, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Actually, I do understand the scope of this project, and that's why I'm speaking up," I replied, my voice stronger than I expected. "If we continue down this path, we're setting ourselves up for failure. I'm not here to undermine you, but to make sure we succeed. That's what matters." I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on me, some of them shifting uncomfortably, while others leaned in, watching the standoff unfold. It was no longer just a confrontation between me and Mr. Harris. It had become a moment of reckoning for everyone in the room. For a long, tense moment, Mr. Harris didn't say anything. The silence was deafening. Then, he did something I never expected. He paused, looked down at the data sheet I had presented, and took a long breath. "You're right," he finally said, his voice lower, a hint of grudging respect in his tone. "The numbers are off. I'll make the adjustments." I couldn't believe my ears. Was this the same man who had reduced me to nothing just weeks ago? The man who had belittled me, crushed my confidence? He was admitting I was right. In front of everyone. The room remained still, no one daring to speak. But in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough, for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear or intimidation. It was a turning point for the office, for our team. Mr. Harris didn't look at me with contempt anymore. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. There was no applause, no grand gestures. But something had shifted. I had earned something more important than his approval. I had earned my self-respect. And for the first time in my life, I felt in control. As the meeting came to an end, I walked out of that conference room with my head held high. I had proven not just to Mr. Harris, but to myself, that I was no longer that worthless dumbass. He had called me. I was someone who stood up for what was right, who fought for my ideas, and who refused to be held down by fear. The battle wasn't over, but in that moment, I knew I had won something much bigger than just this one confrontation. I had found my voice, and nothing, not even Mr. Harris, could take that away from me. The days following the presentation were filled with a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. The office still buzzed with tension, but now there was something else in the air, a palpable shift in the dynamics. The team was no longer as fearful of speaking up, no longer tiptoeing around Mr. Harris in the same way they had before. The walls that had once confined us were slowly crumbling, and for the first time in years, I could see a glimmer of hope. Mr. Harris, however, was a different story. His behavior changed, but not in the way I had expected. The tension between us wasn't entirely gone, and I could feel the weight of his judgment every time we crossed paths. There was no open hostility, but there was a coldness in his eyes, a subtle reminder that he hadn't completely accepted my challenge. He had conceded the data issue, but he hadn't fully embraced the idea that I was no longer the same person, who would quietly take whatever he dished out. One morning, as I sat at my desk, I noticed him lingering near the door of my office. His posture was stiff, and he seemed unsure of how to approach me. For a moment, I wondered if he would try to undermine me again, to bring me down in some way. But instead, he surprised me. "Your name. Can I talk to you for a minute?" His voice was tentative, almost hesitant. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't expected this, but I nodded, signaling for him to come in. As he entered, he closed the door behind him, a rare move. There was no bravado in his step, no sense of superiority. He looked almost vulnerable. "I've been thinking about what happened during that meeting," he began, his tone uncharacteristically calm. "I owe you an apology. You were right. The data was flawed, and I should have listened to you earlier." I blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. I had expected an apology of sorts, but not one that came with such humility. He was the same man who had, just weeks earlier, called me a worthless dumbass. And now here he was, admitting that I had been right all along. "I don't expect things to just go back to normal," he continued. "I've been too hard on you. I've been too hard on everyone. But maybe that's because I thought I could control everything. The way you stood up for yourself. I guess I need to take a step back and figure out how to lead differently." I nodded, still processing his words. It was hard to reconcile this man, who had once wielded his power like a weapon, with the one standing before me now. There was no guarantee that he would change overnight. no assurance that he wouldn't revert to his old ways. But for the first time, I felt like I had gained something from this battle. Not just a fleeting victory, but a shift in the power dynamic. "I appreciate the apology," I said, my voice steady, though the weight of the moment settled in my chest. "But the bigger issue isn't just the data or the meetings, it's the environment here, the way things were before. That's not sustainable. We can't keep working in fear. We need to be a team, not just a group of people trying to stay out of your way." He looked at me for a long moment, the silence between us heavy with understanding. Finally, he nodded. "I get that. And I think you're right. Things need to change, starting with me." And just like that, the balance of power had shifted. It wasn't just Mr. Harris who had changed. It was the entire office. His admission was the first step in a long process of rebuilding trust. People began to speak up more, to collaborate without fear of retaliation. The office, which had once felt like a battlefield, started to feel like a space for growth and opportunity. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges to face. But the environment was evolving, and I was at the forefront of that change. As for me, I had learned more than just how to stand up for myself. I had learned the power of perseverance, of staying true to my values even when everything around me seemed determined to push me down. I had learned that change doesn't come easily, but it is possible, especially when you have the courage to take the first step. A few weeks later, Mr. Harris pulled me aside again, this time in front of the team. "I want to publicly acknowledge your name for her contribution to our recent projects," he said, his tone genuine. "Her hard work and dedication have been instrumental, and I've learned a lot from the way she's handled the challenges we've faced." It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as I looked around the room, I could see the change in my colleagues' eyes. They no longer saw me as someone who was just trying to get by, but as someone who had fought for what was right and won. Things weren't perfect, and I knew there would still be bumps in the road. But as I stood there, surrounded by my colleagues, I realized that I had come a long way from the person Mr. Harris had once called a worthless dumbass. I had found my voice, and more importantly, I had found my strength. The office wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had ever been, and that, in itself, was enough to make me believe that things could continue to change, for all of us. Few months had passed since that pivotal day in the conference room, and while life at the office wasn't without its challenges, it had become a place where respect was no longer just a word, it was a standard. The air was lighter now, filled with collaboration instead of fear. Mr. Harris had taken a step back, acknowledging his mistakes, and although he wasn't perfect, his willingness to change had made all the difference. And I had become someone I didn't even recognize at first. Strong, confident, and capable of standing up for what I believed in. As I sat at my desk one afternoon, reflecting on everything that had transpired, I realized that the most important thing I had gained wasn't the apology from my boss, or the respect of my colleagues, or even the success of the project. What mattered most was the understanding that I had learned to value myself. I had found the courage to speak my truth, to fight for my ideas, and to challenge the systems that kept me down. This journey had taught me that we don't need to wait for permission to change our lives. Sometimes, we have to take matters into our own hands. The courage to stand up for ourselves, to push through the fear and doubt, is where real growth happens. And as I walked out of the office that evening, with a smile on my face and my head held high, I knew that no matter what came next, I was ready. The person who had once been dismissed, who had been called a worthless dumbass, had transformed into someone who was anything but that. The battle for my self-respect had been won, and I wouldn't be going back.